I hired a private investigator and discovered a painful betrayal by my wife and her coworker. My revenge was cruel. When I received the manila envelope, my hands were shaking. The detailed report revealed furtive meetings, passionate messages, promises of a life together. Shock turned to cold, calculating anger when I realized her lover was none other than her boss, promising a promotion in exchange for stolen nights. Destroying both became my only goal. I knew I couldn't act impulsively, I needed to be meticulous, precise. The mask of a devoted husband covered the face of a man planning devastating retaliation. Every step was carefully planned, every movement calculated to ensure they felt the same pain they inflicted on me. Revenge would not be quick, but it would be ruthless. And in the end, everyone would know the price of betrayal. New York, the city that never sleeps, with its bright lights and frenetic pace, hid dark secrets among its imposing skyscrapers and bustling streets. This was where Thomas lived, a seemingly ordinary man, dedicated to work and family. He was a successful financial analyst and known for his impeccable accuracy and ethics. His marriage to Laura seemed rock solid. They were the perfect couple, at least in the eyes of others. Laura, an attractive and ambitious woman, worked as a project manager at a renowned technology company. Her career was on the rise, and she seemed to have it all: a loving husband, a dream job, and a stable life in Manhattan. But behind the impeccable facade, there was a growing dissatisfaction, fueled by his unfulfilled ambitions and desires. Their Upper West Side apartment was an elegant, tastefully decorated retreat. The living room, with its panoramic windows, offered a stunning view of Central Park. However, the beauty of the place contrasted with the silent tension that was beginning to permeate the environment. Thomas, often absorbed in his analyses and reports, failed to notice the subtle signs that something was wrong. Laura's days were a mix of endless meetings, tight deadlines, and constant pressure to excel. His boss, Richard, was a charming and persuasive man with a knack for manipulating people. He had a unique ability to make his employees feel indispensable while maintaining absolute control over them. Laura was no exception. She admired Richard and his leadership abilities, but she also felt a dangerous attraction to him. While Thomas believed that Laura was just dedicated to her career, she began spending more time at the office, citing urgent projects and last-minute meetings. Thomas's lonely nights became more frequent, and he began to question whether he was doing enough to keep his marriage alive. He wanted to believe that everything was fine, but a growing uneasiness began to erode his confidence. Thomas and Laura's relationship began to turn into something mechanical, without the passion and intimacy that once united them. Laura was increasingly distant, and Thomas, not knowing how to fix what was broken, immersed himself even more in his work. He convinced himself that if he worked harder, if he was more successful, everything would go back to normal. But the distance between them only grew. It was on one of these lonely nights that Thomas, sitting in his favorite armchair, looking at the view of the city, made a decision. He needed to know the truth. Something inside him told him that Laura wasn't just overwhelmed with work. There was something more, something he couldn't ignore. With a heavy heart, he hired a private investigator. He knew he was crossing a line, but the need for answers was greater than the guilt. The days that followed were agonizing. Thomas pretended to be normal while awaiting the results of the investigation. Laura continued with her routine, apparently oblivious to the storm that was forming around her. Every time she left for another meeting, Thomas wondered if he was being unfair, if he was imagining things. But doubt, once planted, grew like a weed, suffocating any hope of trust. Meanwhile, Laura was increasingly involved with Richard. Their relationship, which had begun with professional admiration, had evolved into something more intimate. The promises of a promotion and a bright future together became irresistible. Laura was torn between guilt and excitement, between duty and desire. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but the temptation was too strong to resist. Thomas, on the other hand, began to notice subtle changes in Laura's behavior. She was more distant, more distracted. Little lies began to pile up, each one eroding the trust he had in her a little more. He clung to the hope that it was all just a misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew the truth would be devastating. The results of the investigation arrived in a discreet envelope. Thomas hesitated before opening it, fearing what he would find inside. When he finally opened it, the truth hit him like a punch in the gut. Photos of Laura and Richard, together in intimate moments, messages exchanged with promises and confessions. Everything was there, in black and white, indisputable. The pain of betrayal was unbearable, but it soon gave way to cold, calculating anger. Thomas knew he couldn't just confront Laura. He needed to plan his revenge meticulously, make sure she and Richard paid for what they did. He began to plan every detail, every movement, with the precision of a surgeon. Their goal was not just to expose the betrayal, but to completely destroy Laura and Richard's lives, just as they had destroyed their trust. While Laura continued her double life, without suspecting that Thomas knew everything, he prepared to exact his revenge. With each passing day, the mask of a devoted husband covered the face of a man transformed by pain and the thirst for justice. And so, the plot thickened, preparing for the moment when everything would be revealed, and the true price of betrayal would be paid. The weeks following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Thomas. He tried hard to maintain a facade of normalcy, but his mind was constantly hatching plans. Laura remained oblivious to the storm that was brewing, wrapped up in her relationship with Richard and the promises of a better life. The tension in the home was rising, and Thomas took every opportunity to gather more information, ensuring that his revenge would be perfect. Thomas began investigating Richard with the same meticulousness he had used with Laura. He discovered that Richard had an impeccable reputation at the company, but he also found shadows in his past. Little covered-up scandals, suspicious transactions and questionable connections that could destroy your career if they came to light. Thomas compiled this information carefully, building a dossier that would be his ultimate weapon. Meanwhile, Laura became bolder in her encounters with Richard. They took advantage of meetings outside the office, conferences and any excuse to be together. Thomas, aware of this, discreetly installed cameras and microphones in the apartment, recording every conversation, every intimate moment. The evidence was piling up, and with it, his determination for revenge. One day, Thomas decided to act. Without arousing suspicion, he invited Richard and his wife to dinner at his apartment. Richard, confident in his secret, accepted the invitation. Dinner was held in a tense but courteous atmosphere. Thomas watched every interaction, every furtive glance between Laura and Richard. He knew this was just the first step of his plan. During dinner, Thomas casually mentioned an important conference being held in Las Vegas. Richard, always looking for opportunities to strengthen his position in the company, showed interest. Laura, seeing an opportunity to be alone with her lover, suggested that she participate too. Thomas, hiding his satisfaction, supported the idea. The conference in Las Vegas would be the perfect setting for the next phase of their revenge. Thomas made sure Laura and Richard had adjoining rooms in the same hotel. Using his technological skills, he accessed the hotel's security cameras and room reservations, monitoring every movement. Your patience and precision were fundamental at this stage. In Las Vegas, Laura and Richard got carried away by the excitement of the trip, neglecting any precautions. Thomas, from a distance, observed and recorded everything. Taking advantage of a moment when they were out of their rooms, he entered Richard's room and planted incriminating documents and traces of his illegal activities. The plan was in motion and everything was going according to plan. Back in New York, Thomas began anonymously sending the compiled evidence to the company's partners and directors. Each package contained irrefutable evidence of the relationship between Laura and Richard, as well as Richard's illegal activities. The reaction didn't take long. The scandal broke, and Richard was summoned to an emergency meeting with the directors. Laura, realizing what was happening, desperately tried to communicate with Thomas, but he was cold and distant, silently enjoying his victory. The chaos in the company intensified. Richard was suspended pending an internal investigation. Laura, facing the possibility of losing her job and her reputation, went into a state of panic. I tried to maintain my composure, but the pressure was too great. Thomas watched everything with an unsettling calm, knowing that Richard and Laura's downfall was near. As the investigation continued, Thomas made sure the press received leaks about the scandal. The media began publishing sensational articles, increasing the pressure on Richard and the company. Rumors spread quickly, and Richard's reputation was in ruins. Laura, in turn, faced scornful looks and whispers behind her back. The work environment, which was once your refuge, has turned into a minefield of criticism and judgment. Finally, the company made a decision. Richard was fired and was facing possible legal charges for his illicit activities. Laura, although not fired, was relegated to a lesser position, with her career destroyed. The devastation in their lives was complete, but Thomas wasn't finished. He wanted them to feel the same humiliation and despair that he had felt. To deliver the final blow, Thomas arranged a meeting with Laura at his apartment. He prepared everything carefully, knowing that this would be the decisive moment. When Laura arrived, desperate for explanations and seeking comfort, Thomas received her coldly. The confrontation was harsh, full of recriminations and painful truths. Laura, upon realizing that Thomas knew everything, burst into tears, but Thomas remained implacable. The revelation of the details of her revenge, the recordings, the incriminating evidence, left Laura speechless. Every word from Thomas was a stab, every revelation a mortal blow. Laura, completely devastated, understood that she had underestimated Thomas. Her world fell apart in a matter of minutes, and she was left alone, facing the consequences of her actions. The days following the revelation of the betrayal were filled with deafening silence. Thomas, now completely focused on his revenge, continued with his daily routine, but his mind was always plotting the next step. Laura, realizing that something was wrong, tried to get closer, but Thomas maintained an emotional distance that left her confused and distressed. The atmosphere in the apartment was charged. Thomas's every move was calculated, every word measured. He watched Laura with a look that she couldn't decipher, but that made her increasingly nervous. She knew something was about to happen, but she had no idea what was coming. One night, Thomas decided it was time to confront Laura. He called her for a chat in the apartment's office. Laura entered hesitantly, feeling the weight of the moment. Thomas sat behind his desk, his eyes fixed on her, conveying a coldness that made her shiver. "Sit down, Laura. We need to talk," Thomas said, pointing to the chair in front of him. Laura obeyed, slowly sitting up, her eyes fixed on Thomas, trying to understand what was going on in his mind. "What's going on, Thomas? You've been distant, strange. It's scaring me," Laura said, her voice shaking slightly. Thomas remained silent for a moment, evaluating Laura's words before responding. "I think you already know, Laura. You know what's going on," he said, his voice cold and controlled. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to deny it, but she knew something terrible was about to be revealed. "No, I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice betraying her fear. Thomas opened a desk drawer and took out a thick envelope. He placed it on the table between them, never taking his eyes off Laura. "Open it," he ordered, his voice implacable. Laura took the envelope with trembling hands and began to open it, feeling her heart speed up. Inside, he found a series of photos and documents. As he looked at the images, his face turned pale. They were photos of her and Richard, captured in intimate moments, as well as messages exchanged between them. She looked up at Thomas, the look of panic clear on her face. "Thomas, she began, but was interrupted. "There's nothing you can say, Laura. I know everything," Thomas said, his voice low but full of contained anger. "I hired a private investigator. I know about you and Richard. I know about your promises, your lies, your betrayals. Laura began to cry, tears streaming down her face as she tried to find the words to explain, to justify. I'm sorry, Thomas. I made a mistake, it was a moment of weakness. I don't know what to say. She sobbed, trying to hold back the tears. Thomas remained impassive, watching her with an icy gaze. A moment of weakness, Laura. This was more than a moment. It was a series of conscious decisions, over and over again. You chose to betray me, you chose to lie. And worst of all, he chose to get involved with his boss in exchange for a promotion. He said, the words coming out like sharp blades. Laura fell silent, the reality of her actions weighing on her. She knew there was no excuse for what she had done. Thomas, please forgive me. I didn't want to hurt you. She begged, her voice broken with pain and regret. Thomas watched her for a moment, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Pardon me, Laura. I don't know if I can forgive. What you did, destroyed our trust, our marriage. He said, getting up and walking to the window, looking at the city that stretched out below them. But don't worry, I have something in mind. Something that will ensure that Richard and you pay for what you did. Laura felt a new kind of fear rise within her. She knew that Thomas was not a man of empty threats. What do you mean, Thomas? She asked, her voice weak. Thomas turned to her, his eyes shining with grim determination. You'll see, Laura. You will see. The following days were pure hell for Laura. The tension at home was unbearable, and Thomas continued to act with a coldness that terrified her. She tried every possible way to regain his trust, but nothing seemed to work. Each approach attempt was met with an impassable barrier of ice. Meanwhile, Thomas was busy with the final phase of his plan. He met with a renowned lawyer, setting the stage for a devastating divorce. He had all the evidence necessary to ensure that he would emerge victorious, both in court and in public opinion. Laura and Richard's every move was meticulously documented, and he was ready to use everything to his advantage. One afternoon, Thomas arranged to meet Richard at a discreet cafe in the city. Richard, ignorant of the real reason for the meeting, attended punctually, believing it would just be a conversation between colleagues. Thomas greeted him with a fake smile, inviting him to sit down. Richard, thanks for coming. I wanted to talk about something very important. Thomas said, keeping his voice controlled. Richard, suspecting nothing, nodded, expecting the conversation to be about business. Of course, Thomas. What is it about? Richard asked, taking a sip of his coffee. Thomas placed an envelope on the table, similar to the one he had shown Laura. Richard looked at the envelope curiously, but still didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Open it, ordered Thomas, leaning back in the chair and carefully observing Richard's reaction. Richard opened the envelope and, as he leafed through the photos and documents, his face lost color. He looked up at Thomas, shocked and in disbelief. Thomas, he began, but was interrupted. You don't need to say anything, Richard. I know everything about you and Laura. I know about the nights at the hotel, the promises of promotion in exchange for favors. I have all the proof I need. Thomas said, keeping his tone calm, but with a look that left no doubt about his seriousness. Richard tried to compose himself, but the feeling of panic was evident. Thomas, I can explain. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. He stuttered, trying to find a way out. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. It didn't mean anything. You destroyed my marriage, Richard. You and Laura betrayed me in the worst way possible. And now, you will pay for it. Thomas said, leaning forward, his gaze fixed on Richard. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. The company, the family, the friends. You're going to lose everything, Richard. Richard, desperate, tried to appeal to Thomas for mercy. Please, Thomas. We can solve this another way. I will do anything. Richard begged, his voice shaking. Thomas stood up, taking the envelope back and placing it in his briefcase. I've already decided, Richard. What you have done cannot be undone. Prepare to face the consequences, he said, turning to leave. As Thomas walked away, Richard sat stunned, realizing his life was about to fall apart. Back at the apartment, Thomas found Laura waiting anxiously. She knew something had happened, but she didn't know exactly what. Thomas entered and looked at her with a dark expression. I met with Richard. He knows you told me everything, said Thomas, bluntly. Laura felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She was trapped in a web of lies and betrayal, not knowing how to escape. Thomas, what did you do? She asked, her voice trembling. Thomas walked up to her, his eyes filled with implacable coldness. I just gave Richard a taste of what's to come. And now, it's your turn to face reality, Laura, he said, handing her a new envelope. Laura opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside, he found the divorce documents along with the incriminating evidence. She began to cry again, realizing that her world was falling apart irreversibly. Thomas, please. We can resolve this. It doesn't have to be like this. She begged, but knew it was too late. Thomas watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. He knew his marriage had ended the moment he discovered the betrayal, but now, seeing the devastation in Laura's eyes, he felt an emptiness that revenge couldn't fill. I already decided, Laura. It's all over. You chose this path. Now, you will pay the price, he said, walking out of the apartment, leaving Laura alone to face the consequences of her actions. The full revelation of Thomas's plan shook Laura and Richard's lives to the core. The company, upon becoming aware of all the transgressions, decided to act quickly to protect its reputation. Richard was fired immediately and faced a criminal investigation for his illicit activities. Laura, despite keeping her job, was transferred to an irrelevant position, far from any possibility of advancement. His career dream was destroyed. Thomas, after serving Laura with divorce papers, moved into a small apartment in the city center. He needed time away from everything to reflect on the next steps in his life. The revenge had been meticulously planned and executed, but the feeling of emptiness persisted. The betrayal had left deep scars, and he knew it would take time to fully recover. Meanwhile, Laura faced the consequences of her actions alone. The humiliation at work was constant, and she avoided going out, fearing people's judgmental looks. Her friends and family, upon discovering the truth, moved away, leaving her even more isolated. She spent her days trying to understand how she had gotten to this point, bitterly regretting her choices. Richard, on the other hand, was desperately trying to save what little was left of his life. With his reputation destroyed, he found himself surrounded by legal and financial problems. Without a job and with an uncertain future, he began to realize how fragile the promises of a bright future he had made to Laura were. Now, he was alone, facing imminent collapse. On a cold winter night, Thomas received an unexpected call. It was Laura. He hesitated before answering, but decided to listen to what she had to say. Thomas, please, I need to talk to you, said Laura, her voice full of despair. Thomas remained silent for a moment before responding. What do you want, Laura? He asked, keeping his tone cold. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but please, I need help. I'm destroyed. I don't know what to do, she begged, her voice trembling. Thomas felt a mixture of compassion and anger. He knew Laura was hurting, but the wound was still too deep for him to simply forgive and forget. Laura, you made your choices. And now he's facing the consequences, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Laura began to cry, tears mixing with her words. I know, Thomas. I know I made a mistake, and I regret it every day. But please, I just need someone to listen to me, to help me find a way. She pleaded. Thomas was silent, pondering what to do. He knew that, despite everything, he still cared for Laura in some way. He decided to find her, but made it clear that he wasn't promising anything. They met in a small cafe, away from prying eyes. Laura was visibly haggard, with deep circles under her eyes and an expression of despair. Thomas sat across from her, maintaining an emotional distance. "What do you want, Laura?" he asked again, this time more softly. Laura took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "I know that I destroyed our marriage and that I deserve everything I'm going through. But I'm lost, Thomas. I need help to start over. I need to understand how to move forward," she said, her voice full of pain. Thomas watched her for a moment, feeling a pang of sadness. He knew that revenge had brought justice, but not the peace he had hoped for. He was still hurt, but decided to offer some empathy. "Laura, I'm also trying to understand how to move forward. What happened between us can't be undone, but maybe we can find a way to live with it," he said, his voice calm. Laura nodded, feeling momentary relief. They talked for hours, trying to find some understanding amid the chaos their lives had become. Although the pain was still there was a small glimmer of hope that they could eventually find a way to move forward, even if they were apart. The months that followed Thomas and Laura's last conversation were one of slow recovery and drastic changes. Thomas, now living alone in his small apartment, dedicated himself to work and rebuilding his life. He found a therapist who helped him deal with the conflicting emotions and pain that the betrayal had left behind. Each session was a step towards regaining trust in yourself and others. Laura, in turn, decided she needed a fresh start away from New York. She requested a transfer to a branch of the company in another city, accepting the modest position she was offered. It was a way to start over, away from painful memories and judgmental looks. In the new city, she focused on rediscovering who she was, away from Richard's shadow and the expectations she had created for herself. Richard, facing lawsuits and the total loss of his career, found himself in a rapid decline. Without Laura's support and isolated from everyone, he gave in to despair. The illicit activities that once brought him power and influence have now turned against him. One dark night, unable to deal with the pressure and shame, Richard made a fateful decision. His body was found in his apartment, the victim of an intentional drug overdose. The news of his death shocked everyone, but for Thomas and Laura, it was a grim reminder of the consequences of their actions. Thomas learned of Richard's death through the news and felt a mix of emotions. Revenge had been fulfilled in a way he never imagined. Richard's death, although tragic, symbolized the end of a painful chapter. But it also made him reflect on the cost of his own quest for justice. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could choose how he moved forward. Laura received the news with an overwhelming sense of guilt. Although she knew that Richard was responsible for many of her own misfortunes, she could not help but feel partly to blame for his fate. Richard's death led her to deep introspection, and she decided to seek professional help to deal with her guilt and rebuild her life. Thomas, after much reflection, made a surprising decision. He reached out to Laura once again, not to rekindle the relationship, but to offer real closure. They found themselves in a peaceful park, where autumn leaves fell softly around them. "Laura, I heard about Richard. I'm sorry about what happened," Thomas said, with a sincerity that Laura hadn't expected. She looked at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Me too, Thomas. I never wanted things to end like this," she replied, her voice breaking. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last words he would say to her. "I know we can't change the past, but I want you to know that, despite everything, I hope you find peace and a new life. Maybe one day, we can look back and see this as a lesson, something that made us stronger," he said, extending his hand to her. Laura took his hand, feeling a rush of emotions. She knew she could never undo what she had done, but Thomas's offer of real closure was an important step for both of them. "Thank you, Thomas. I wish the same for you," she said, squeezing his hand gently. They said goodbye there, with a mutual understanding that this would be their last meeting. Thomas watched as Laura walked away, feeling a strange relief mixed with sadness. He knew he had done everything he could to resolve the situation and that now it was time to move on. On the way home, Thomas passed a bookstore and decided to go inside. He had always loved reading, and this seemed like the perfect time to rediscover an old pleasure. As he leafed through the books, he felt a sense of renewal. Revenge had consumed much of his time and energy, but now he could see a future beyond the pain. Laura, upon arriving in her new city, began participating in a support group. She found comfort in sharing her experiences and hearing those of others. Each session helped her rebuild her self-esteem and find a new purpose. She knew the journey would be long, but she was determined to move forward. The end for each of the characters was a new beginning, shaped by the consequences of their actions. Thomas found new peace as he put revenge behind him and focused on rebuilding his life. Laura began a path of redemption, learning to forgive herself and seek a better future. And Richard's memory served as a painful reminder that choices have profound and often irreversible consequences. And so, the story of betrayal and revenge came to an end, not with complete redemption, but with painful and necessary acceptance. The characters went their separate ways, each carrying lessons learned and hope for a brighter future.